Welcome. My name is Rebecca Slayton. For anybody who doesn't know me, I'm an associate professor in the Department of Science and Technology Studies and the director of the Repi Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies at Cornell. I want to start with a brief land acknowledgement. Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayakono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayakono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayakono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayakono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. Today, we're delighted to be hearing from David Cortright, who is Professor Emeritus of the Practice at the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. Previously, David was the Director of Policy Studies at the Keough School's Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies and Director of the Institute's Peace Accords Matrix Project, the largest existing collection of implementation data on intrastate peace agreements. So David has written widely about nonviolent social change, nuclear disarmament, and the use of multilateral sanctions and incentives as tools of international peacekeeping and peacemaking. He has provided research services to the foreign ministries of Canada, Denmark, Germany, Japan, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Switzerland, and has served as a consultant or advisor to agencies of the United Nations, the Carnegie Commission on Preventing Deadly Conflict, the International Peace Academy, and the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. I also want to add that David has been a wonderfully engaged member of our community here at Cornell for the last few years. And personally, I find David's ability to keep working for peace in a very actually realistic and practical way, even when there's strong pressures to just lose all hope and become disengaged, very inspiring. So looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you for a lovely introduction. And thanks to all of you for coming. Thank you, students. I appreciated your discussion and comments on the reading, and we'll talk about some of these points as we go along. We're gathering at a decisive moment in the history of the atomic age, 80 years since the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, at a time when the bomb is back big time and spreading rapidly. It's a time of great peril, an accelerating global arms race. The US is leading this effort, upgrading and expanding and rebuilding its nuclear weapons capacity. Russia has been making threats of actual use of these weapons and building more weapons. China is now a rising nuclear power. And of course, the proliferation threats in North Korea, Pakistan, India, Israel, and Iran. And the previous agreements between the US and Russia to limit these weapons have been dismantled, discarded, and the last remaining treaty, the New START, is about to expire. The guardrails will fall off and an unlimited arms race may ensue, accelerate even more. But I want to argue that this is also a moment of opportunity. And there's been some evidence of renewed public concern about the arms race, a growing number of articles. The Oppenheimer film of 2 years ago had an impact, I think. And we're about to see a new film, a Netflix film, maybe some of you have heard about it, A House of Dynamite. Will have limited theater release on October 10, but then it'll be released globally, streaming on October 24th. I haven't seen it yet, but friends who have tell me it really packs a wallop in describing the peril of relying on nuclear weapons for our security. And there are rapid developments here. Just a couple of days ago, Vladimir Putin unexpectedly said that Russia is willing to hold the line on any further weapons buildup. Will stay within the terms of the New START treaty if the US will do the same. We'll say a lot more about that here as we go along. So what I'm talking about are developments in real time as pressure will increase on the US to reciprocate Putin's initiative. I think our conversation could hardly be more timely. My core proposition is that the political power necessary to stop the arms race will not emerge from the political leadership in Washington. The impetus for change will have to come from the bottom up, from social advocacy and grassroots pressure. I'll begin today by telling some of my own story and my journey through being interested in peace. I'll review some of the findings of the readings that students have read by Cambridge University, Element, Protest, and Policy, various recent peace movements, and share some observations on the elements of an effective advocacy movement. And then the main focus will be later on a presentation on the new arms race and especially what the opportunities are for trying to halt and reverse the arms race. So I'll begin with my story. How did I become interested in peace studies? It's a very unusual and unexpected journey. I was drafted to be a soldier during the Vietnam War. I graduated from college in 1968. I had no interest in the military. I had no political concerns. I didn't even know where Vietnam was hardly. But it was the time when the war was raging. That year, more than 15,000 US troops died in Vietnam. The draft was also raging and they were trying to pick up everybody. And just a few days after I returned from my university studies, I got my notice for the military draft. There's nothing like being drafted into a war to get your attention going on issues of war and peace. And as I went into the Army and started to talk to the veterans who are coming back from Vietnam, and as I read, I became increasingly horrified to learn what was actually going on in Vietnam. And so I became a peacenik, a peace activist inside the Army. There we go. And this is a photo of me in 1969, speaking out against the war. This was a poster that was circulated within the anti-war movement. And it was a reflection of the commitment that I made at the time that I had to speak out against the war. It was so horrifying to think about the United States bombing Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos and waging this war against people whose only desire was to be free of foreign domination. They had no argument with us. So I felt I had to speak out. And that commitment obviously changed my life. My worldview turned upside down. We took a lot of risks. We faced some punishments for speaking out against the war. But I felt we had to do it. And that gave me a sense of commitment to the cause of peace and an understanding that the problem of war is huge and has very little, is very seldom focused upon in society, but not enough attention to problems of peace. So I try to commit myself and I've stayed with it, as Rebecca said, all of these many years since. And this relates to one of the questions that students raised in their discussion earlier. What are the mechanisms for change in when movements evolve? And one of them is that there are loyalty shifts, that those who are in the military or in the police or in the administrative agencies begin to have doubts about the war. And some of them are kind of crazy like me and speak out publicly, but many others work within their agencies to try to slow down the process, to gum up the works and change the system. And this has really been a big factor. You may not ever change the mind of the political leaders. In fact, seldom do. But if you can convince enough people who have to work the system and to follow and carry out the orders, then you can begin to make change. So I was part of this, and I was an element of the GI peace movement, one of the least known, but arguably most important elements of the decade-long Vietnam anti-war movement that we write about in the reading that you had for the class. So in my journey of studying and deepening my commitment to peace, I focused a lot on the personality and the teachings and the experiences and example of Mohandas Gandhi. So I had many trips to Europe. I studied in the Gandhi Library at the Rajghat in Old Delhi. I met and talked with some of Gandhi's grandchildren, some of the former activists who worked with Gandhi. And all during this period, I really began to understand the power of nonviolence and also the importance of strategic nonviolence. Gandhi was a master of political strategy, and he figured out how to use non-cooperation and resistance in order to undermine British rule. So it was a fascinating part of my life, and learned a lot about Gandhi. Of course, he was very austere and difficult, not the kind of person you'd want to go have a cup of coffee or a beer with. And he didn't drink, he didn't drink coffee even. He had hardly any possessions. He had no power, no money. He was an extreme vegetarian. His earliest publications were on vegetarianism. He hardly had any clothes on. Churchill mocked him as being half naked. Very humorless, you would think. But Gandhi actually had a unique ability to crack a joke at the right time and tell you the one story that I like a lot. In 1931, when there was a negotiation between the British and the independence movement, Gandhi found himself in London, and he was invited to have an audience with the king at the palace. So he showed up on the appointed day in very chilly, raw weather of London with his, loincloth and a shawl over his shoulders and his sandals, and that was it. And the reporters are rather appalled and said, "Mr. Gandhi, don't you think you're underdressed for the occasion?" And he replied, "Well, that's all right. His Majesty has on enough clothes for both of us." And on the same occasion, he was asked, "Mr. Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization?" He said, "Well, I think it would be a good idea." But strategy ideas and all that were really significant, and it's guided my life in terms of my research and practice in peace movements and peace advocacy. Of course, in this study that we've been reading, I'll talk a lot about the various movements, and especially focus here for this discussion on the nuclear disarmament movements of the 1980s, the nuclear freeze, in which I participated. And this is an element that's rarely understood, but part of the nuclear enterprise has always been a process of movements and protests, sometimes from those who are at the heart of the nuclear enterprise. And throughout the atomic age, any progress towards arms limitation has been the result of social protest and organized political advocacy. The campaign of the nuclear scientists, those who actually built the bomb, organized in the 40s for civilian control of atomic energy. In the 1950s and early 60s, there was a movement to stop atmospheric nuclear testing because of the radiation accumulation in the teeth and the bones of children from all of the atmospheric nuclear testing. And then the nuclear freeze movement itself. All of these campaigns generated pressure for change. And as the students said in the discussion, activists often have difficulty recognizing success. When you're out there protesting and political leaders rebuke you, don't respond, it's easy to feel powerless, to believe that our actions are futile, even when they're starting to have impact. And the results of activism are often ambiguous. They may emerge in unexpected ways or have effects far into the future. The great writer Rebecca Solnit wrote, "It is always too early to calculate effect. We can never know how our actions today may influence it." The nuclear freeze movement was really one of the largest nuclear movements in history, and was enormously successful at attracting mass support. This was the march in June 12, 1982. People are in the middle of the streets entering into Central Park when nearly 1 million people gathered to call for freezing and reversing the arms race. And also in the nuclear freeze movement, there were ballot initiatives in 10 states and dozens of cities in which people voted on the proposition to freeze the US and Soviet nuclear arms race. And 18 million people voted on the freeze resolution that year, 60% voting in favor. And then there was the pervasive grassroots presence of the freeze movement. It really was everywhere, and every town had a freeze group, and it exerted constant pressure. So how did it bring about change? The White House attacked the freeze movement. Ronald Reagan and Vice President Bush relentlessly criticized the movement, but it was really too popular to ignore completely. And Reagan himself began to change his rhetoric. He came into office as a fire-breathing anti-Soviet advocate for more nuclear weapons. But by 1983 and 84, he began to change his tune. His rhetoric shifted more towards supporting arms control. And he toned down his bellicose rhetoric and promised to negotiate for peace. Nuclear saber rattling gave way to messages of moderation and support for arms control. And all of this occurred, it's important to emphasize, before Gorbachev arrived on the scene in 1985. Ronald Reagan, who was re-elected in 1984, was very different than the Reagan of 1980. The Freeze campaign created a political climate conducive to arms control, and Reagan adjusted his sails accordingly. And then when he did meet with Gorbachev, the two of them were able to develop a rapport. And of course, there were very significant agreements to reduce nuclear weapons. The Freeze movement had many other impacts. It actually had quite a significant legislative impact. This is one of those mechanisms of change that can occur in a society where there is a legislature, parliamentary system. And through legislative lobbying, the Freeze movement and activists were able to cut back the MX missile system and also to bring a halt to nuclear testing. Nuclear testing stopped in the atmosphere, but it went underground, and through successive legislative campaigns in the 1980s into the early 90s, the Congress actually legislated a halt to US nuclear testing. This was the result of activist pressure. So there were many ways in which the Freeze movement impacted policy, and the reading goes into that in some depth. I want to shift now to some of the elements of success and the factors and features of activism that are most likely associated with change. And history shows that movements can be effective if they employ wise strategies. So again, strategic nonviolence, if they attract widespread public support, articulate compelling messages and narratives, and are persistent in applying pressure for change. In this analysis, I draw a lot from our colleague here at Notre Dame, at Cornell, Professor Sid Taro from sociology, Charles Tilley, great sociologist who passed away, Erica Chenoweth, the great scholar of civil resistance, and Gene Sharp, the great scholar of nonviolent action. So I'll summarize a few principles here that are summarized there. Movements succeed when they attract mass participation, especially grassroots support. Chenoweth argues that this is the most important factor. The larger the movement, the greater the chances of success. Movements need visionary goals to inspire activists, such as a world without nuclear weapons. But they also need practical, achievable policy objectives, such as halting the development of new weapons, which is on the agenda today. The power of movements depends on building broad coalitions and diverse coalitions. The media communications dimensions are key, especially now with social media. And within that, the critical dimension is how we frame messages. What is the basis of the narrative that can attract people to us? And then, obviously, as I write throughout this book, it is necessary to engage in institutional politics, the inside and the outside. Movements have to be able to bring about specific changes in policy, in addition to creating a political climate that's appropriate for change. Professor Tilley had a really interesting framework on the performative politics, as he called it. And this reminds us that social movements are essentially performances. They are campaigns and movements and mobilization of people in order to reflect a story, to tell a story, to be part of a drama in which the issues and the characters change. And how to do that is a bit of a mystery, but Tilley, I think, quite well talked about these four factors. So worthiness, it means you have to be attractive to people, and you have to have a reputation and an image of fighting for a worthy, noble cause. And that also means that you can attract people from all walks of life. If your movement is only one class of people and only one age group, the chances of achieving on a broad policy frame is much less. A colleague of mine, Cora Weiss, who was one of the leaders of the peace movement, always said, I want to organize protests that are safe and comfortable for children. I want to be able to bring my children to these peace rallies. And I think that's a nice way of thinking about a performative framing in which you're attracting people, including children, and there's a role for everybody to play. The idea of unity, that movements have to project an image of unity, not divisiveness. I mean, they are divisive, and anti-war movements especially cause political conflict and some disunity. But the message for the movement itself is one of unity. We all come together, and especially today in the moment of so much political divisiveness, have to find ways to also attract Republicans and Trump supporters to our movements. I'll say a word about that here soon. Numbers, this is the same as what Erica Chenoweth says, mass participation. You have to have large numbers. And then commitment, this is an interesting dimension. We have to be able to show as activists that we're persistent, that we're willing to sacrifice, that we're willing to show up again and again, even when it doesn't appear that we're making much change. And Gandhi and others would say, be willing to suffer, to sacrifice, to show the depth of our commitment and to show our commitment to nonviolence, not harming others, but be willing to suffer ourselves if necessary. So all these dimensions, I think, fit together in terms of figuring out the impacts of movements. So I want to talk now about the arms race issues and what we can do about it more specifically. So the principal source for all of us who study weapons and nuclear arms race is the Stockholm International Peace Research materials, their annual reports. And this year's report is quite alarming and shows that the arms race is rapidly developing. And the numeric limits for the US and Russia have remained the same. That's because of this treaty, the New START agreement. So each side have 1,700 or so deployed nuclear weapons. And the stored weapons are more than 1,900 for the US, almost 2,600 for Russia. And China is also now an actor. It has almost 600 nuclear warheads. The interesting thing about China's nuclear program, however, is that while they have growing numbers of weapons, they so far have only deployed actively a small number, about 25. And this may be a result of their traditional policy, which was to have nuclear weapons, warheads, the bombs, and then have the nuclear missiles, but they kept them separated. And it appears that that's still part of their policy. And it is obviously significant in terms of the risk of nuclear war, first use. So anyway, the CIPRI documents are always the most authoritative source. And they are related to the Federation of American Scientists nuclear notebooks, which come out, and those data sources are intertwined and the most reliable source. There was a very interesting article a few months ago in the Nation magazine by this freelance reporter, which really looked very much in depth at the US nuclear arsenal and the US nuclear buildup and the rebuilding and refurbishing of US nuclear weapons. And he created this graphic. Obviously, we're not able to see that and read it all at this point. And even in the magazine, it's hard to read. But it's a really valuable piece that shows how extensive the US nuclear arsenal is with ground-based missiles, submarine-based missiles, and many different forms of aircraft, and all of which are being upgraded and developed. I saw on the news today that just yesterday, there were 4 nuclear weapons missiles submarines, missiles fired from submarines from this base here in Georgia. They went down to southern part of Florida and launched 4 ballistic missiles out over the Atlantic. This normal, quote, testing of US nuclear weapons. Each of those missiles in real life would have 8 nuclear warheads. Well, not enough would be enough to destroy the whole country. So these programs are very real. They're all being upgraded, and the dangers are rapidly growing. And there's increasing numbers of us. I won't go into numbers. If you have questions, we can go into the details. And I think actually a focus on numbers in nuclear weapons, which is the big game that's played in Washington, is very misleading. Because it only takes a small number of weapons to completely destroy a whole country. And even the Pentagon itself said they could get by with 1,000. Well, 1,000 nuclear weapons would destroy all of Russia several times over, dozens of times over. And of course would have catastrophic effects on the world environment. The point is, what do we do about it? And there's increasing numbers who now feel that we have to speak out and become more active, that we cannot remain silent about the nuclear issue. In the film, Dr. Strangelove, the subtitle was, I learned to love the bomb. And actually, over the years, we forgot about the bomb, the nuclear reductions. More than 80% of nuclear weapons were reduced at the time of the Reagan, Gorbachev, Bush arms treaties. But now they're back, and it's necessary to register disapproval. And increasingly among the arms control groups, there's an agreement around this call. There was a gathering in Washington in July, which I spoke, in which this was released. And there are dozens of major groups, Arms Control Association, Federation of American Scientists, all the groups have now signed on to this appeal. And the core message of more nuclear weapons do not make us safer. And calling for all nuclear states a halt where they are now, and then to move towards reversing the arms race. So obviously this is drawing lessons from and related to the original nuclear freeze movement of the 1980s. Although times are different, so the language and the demands are different. But this is an agenda that we think can be a unifying program for many groups to work together. And nuclear activism is starting to grow. But the big challenge for the nuclear movement today is that the urgency of so many other issues. The massive anti-Trump protests in the hands-off movement and then the No Kings mobilizations have been historic. We're in a moment of unprecedented citizen activization and citizen mobilization, which is encouraging and inspiring. But the movement is focused, as it needs to be, primarily on domestic issues, on the grave crisis of the threats to democracy, the challenges to the US Constitution. The list of outrages is endless, sadly. And the focus has to be on that. And there will be a new round of No Kings rally. I think it's October 18. And I went to one of the organizing meetings recently, and the focus is going to be on healthcare. The fact that this new Republican legislation will cut more than $1 trillion from funding for healthcare and food programs for those who have the greatest need. So that's obviously the greatest human need and something that can build the greatest unity for a movement to try to counter the Trumpist agenda. So where does the disarmament movement, where does the demand for reduced nuclear weapons, for cutting back on military spending? Some would say, well, Trump is a peace candidate because he's cutting back on military budget, which is completely false. The military budget is now topping $1 trillion in the US, highest that it's ever been. So to address this monstrous challenge in the midst of all the other agendas that we have is a difficult one. I don't know that there's an easy answer, but certainly it means that those who are concerned about weapons and military spending need to be in dialogue and work in mutual support with the existing movements, to engage with the domestic policy groups and find ways in which we can work together. And partly, I think this is possible when we think about what are the requirements for the progressive domestic agenda. We need to shift funding to human needs, restore the funding that has been cut, and enhance programs to support science and so many other needs in our society. Well, I would make the argument that this domestic agenda requires a reduction in excessive military spending and a shift in budget prioritized to emphasize social and environmental needs rather than preparations for war. This understanding hopefully can create a basis for cooperation. And also this requires strategic messaging and clear narratives that can attract support across social sectors. An example that recently has developed when they passed this horrendous budget bill recently, and also at the time when the US was bombing Iran, was healthcare, not warfare. Let's focus on healthcare, and that certainly is the agenda for the New Kings rally that's coming up. And also to emphasize the human costs of nuclear weapons and testing and the horrors that would result from any use of these weapons. And I think opportunities for cooperation may evolve if we can find ways to communicate these realities and talk about the contrasts in funding. So one of the ones that I try to emphasize is now over this new budget bill that was just passed includes cuts in Medicare and supplemental nutrition programs and other vital social programming that will amount to approximately $1 trillion over the next decade under this bill. So that's actually the amount of money that the US will spend on nuclear weapons over the next decade. So you have $1 trillion being cut from Medicaid, especially, but other social programs, and $1 trillion that's going to build more nuclear weapons that we don't need, that will make the world a more dangerous place. So clearly, there needs to be a change, and these stark, distorted priorities need to be emphasized. How do we do this? Well, we may be able to figure out a way to work with Trump as erratic, and I won't use adjectives here, but you can guess my views of Trump. But he says so many weird things, but he's also said a lot about so-called denuclearization. It's interesting. And I call attention especially to the middle statement when he was asked recently about the expiration of the New START treaty and said that, well, that's something you don't want expiring. And when you take off nuclear restrictions, that's a big problem. That's true. Sometimes what Trump says is important and useful. Now, does he take it seriously? No, there's nobody in the government actually working on these things. The Arms Control Association is a great organization. I work with them a lot, and they keep checking, is there anybody working on new agreements? And not really. But maybe there's a way to begin to use this. And if Trump said these words, maybe some Republican members of Congress and others might be willing to sign on to the appeal that I mentioned earlier, but also now to a more specific agenda and demand relating to Putin's unexpected but very important observation that Russia will continue to adhere to the New START agreements. So we've come up with a kind of a new appeal. This is still too wordy, but a petition is being developed along these lines, basically to emphasize why these treaties are important and that this treaty will expire. There's no way you can renew it. And the fact that Putin has made this statement and said he will adhere to the limits as long as the US does the same means that there's an obligation now on the United States to reciprocate. And the demand is, of course, precisely to do that and to include that the two sides should sit down to negotiate a new treaty, hopefully a more enduring treaty that would begin to reduce nuclear weapons back to where we were in the early 90s, when there was a sequence of treaties that reduced nuclear weapons. So this has become a petition, and I'm working like literally yesterday and later today with a number of organizers and groups around the country to turn this into a really sharply worded, concise petition, and then bring it to the No Kings protests. October 18, down here in Washington Park, there'll be a big rally. Probably many of you were at the last one. And right now, I think there's like 1,600 events registered that will take place all over the country. So if those who are concerned about nuclear and other issues can bring these kinds of petitions to those rallies, that's a way of kind of combining forces. And we'll be doing that here. And colleagues up in Syracuse are doing the same, and so there'll be other efforts. So all of this is an attempt to try to build the pressure to get Trump to do the right thing, and not only just to extend the limits of the treaty, but to enter into negotiation. Now, some would say, well, this is a slam dunk. Of course, he'll do that. And I think it's likely, I don't know, possible that he will do it. But also keep in mind that there's a huge military industrial sector in the US government. And in Congress, there's a military industrial system where these members of Congress vote continuously for more weapons and nuclear weapons because it brings jobs and money to their district and more campaign contributions for them. These people are mobilized to continue the arms race. Legislation that was passed last year specifically says that when New START expires, they're going to start loading more warheads onto existing missiles. If that happens, Russia will start doing the same and we'll be off to the dangerous races. So it is a struggle, and it's one that's hidden from normal press coverage and understanding of the politics of Washington, which makes this kind of an agenda even more urgent. To get Trump to make this commitment and hopefully then get enough Republicans to go along with it, that it can be sustained. Negotiations for a new agreement can come on into the future. So all of this is a minor step forward if it occurs. The students, you talked about, incremental change, limited gains that sometimes are at risk soon after they're adopted. But that's been the case in the nuclear age all along. We make some small changes. Sometimes they lead to dramatic improvements, like at the end of the Cold War. And the hope is that something like this can be a first step in implementing the broader appeal to halt and reverse the arms race, leading to that ultimate goal, which is reductions and the eventual elimination of nuclear weapons, implementation of the UN Treaty for the prohibition on nuclear weapons, TPNW. Is it likely to happen? Well, not in the near term, probably. But if we can learn from the successes of the past and adopt the lessons and are persistent and strategic in building broader movements and campaigns, we can begin to turn the tide. Thank you very much.